So yes, I will be looking into kind of the main ESG regulatories and ratings that are kind of being predominantly seen at the moment. So sustainability is now a mainstream issue and is due to become even more fundamental as we move closer to net zero deadlines and reporting regulations following from COP26. There are clear indications that the real estate sector will remain a prime target for global policy action, having profound implications for both building owners and occupiers. Furthermore, many existing properties are not future-proof, falling behind when competing for talent in the mid to longer term. As many of you may be aware, we are having new regulations come through from a European side. The global view is that there is a need for change, the reason being that there is less trust with data on its own. Companies and people can manipulate and abuse data, which means that there is less trust from investors, stakeholders, and others in having a data-only approach to reporting and disclosure. The result of that is to develop a system which involves having data supported by behaviours. This allows us to better understand the contextualization of what is being presented, as well as the description that underpins the data. This means that many companies will have disclosure gaps and therefore be at a disadvantage. So I will cover the top four listed, being the ISSB, the SASB, CSDD, and CSRD in more detail. But in a broad sense, the ISSB is a global baseline for high quality sustainability disclosure standards to meet investor demands for transparent, reliable sustainability reporting and will contribute to addressing greenwashing. SASB, or the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, is it aims to align organizations and investors on the financial impacts of ESG. It has industry-specific standards focused on material aspects of an organization's sustainability performance. The corporate sustainability due diligence enforces a corporate due diligence duty on in-scope companies operating in Europe to help ensure they are contributing to sustainable development and the sustainable transition of economies. The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive requires disclosure and data on the impacts of companies' activities on people and the planet and any sustainability risks they are exposed to. The double materiality aspect means that businesses have to disclose the risks they face from a changing climate, but also the impacts that they may cause to climate and society. The TCFD outlines recommendations to assist companies in better accounting for climate-related risks in their financial and mainstream disclosures. The EED and the EPBD are energy monitoring and performance of buildings to move towards net zero for new buildings, refurbishments and operations. The sustainability disclosure requirements continue disclosure requirements that will consolidate and broaden sustainability reporting for UK companies. And finally, the UK Green Taxonomy are a set of criteria for determining whether economic activity can legitimately be described as green or sustainable. So the CSDD aims to harmonise rules at the EU level and to create a level playing field between EU companies. It enforces a corporate due diligence duty on in-scope companies to help ensure they are contributing to sustainable development and the sustainable transition of economies. The disclosure will be in relation to the company's own operations, as well as in relation to their subsidiaries and value chains. Companies will need to demonstrate knowledge of risks and the impacts they could have on human rights and the environment in their value chains and own operations. In February of this year, the European Commission unveiled its long-awaited proposal for the CSDD, which means that the directive will start to apply 2 years after its entry into the force and 4 years for small and medium enterprises. The European Sustainability Reporting Standards, or ESRS, is the overarching framework which will set mandatory disclosure requirements under the EU's CSRD, which will be its delivery mechanism. In February 2023, the European Central Bank expressed support for the draft ESRS, which strengthens the implementation of sustainability disclosure requirements under the CSRD. The GRI reporting process and content will be highly relevant for companies preparing for new disclosure requirements. And from 2024, the ESRS will apply to 50,000 companies. In April 2021, the European Commission published a proposal for the CSRD to revise and strengthen rules introduced by the NFRD. It was produced with the aim of ending greenwashing, strengthening the EU's social market economy, and lay the groundwork for sustainability reporting standards at a global level. The CSRD enforces the disclosure of data on the impact of companies' activities on people and the planet, and any sustainability risks they are exposed to. As I mentioned previously, the double materiality aspect means that businesses have to disclose the risk that they face from a changing climate, but also the impacts that they may cause to climate and society. Late last year, the CSRD was made officially binding when the EU published the directive in the official journal. And companies will need to report on policies, the outcomes of policies, risks, and KPIs covering 5 dimensions, those being the environmental protection, social responsibility and treatment of employees, respect for human rights, anti-corruption and bribery, and diversity on company boards. The ISSB was announced at COP26 in Glasgow in 2021. It has the ambition to become the new standard-setting body of the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, sitting alongside the International Accounting Standards Board. The ISSB aims to meet investor demands for transparent, reliable sustainability reporting and help to address greenwashing. It is a comprehensive global baseline for high-quality sustainability disclosure standards. The framework will facilitate compatibility with various jurisdiction-specific disclosure requirements, such as the CSRD. In February of this year, its first 2 disclosure standards for companies were signed off, including one that references GRI and the EU Sustainability Reporting Standards, which is the ESRS. These are expected to be issued by the end of June this year. SASB was founded as a non-profit organisation in 2011 to help businesses and investors develop a common language about the financial impacts of sustainability. It has industry-specific standards focused on material aspects of an organisation's sustainability performance. Any corporation can use SASB to guide its disclosure, and disclosure standards are offered for more than 75 industries to ensure information disclosed is most relevant to the financial performance of an organisation's industry. This table visualises the landscape of differences that we will end up having. As you can see, ISSB is a standard, whereas the CSRD and the SEC law are legal requirements. On the other hand, the CSRD is for all stakeholders, whereas the ISSB and the SEC law are only for users of financial reporting. Furthermore, the ISSB and the SEC law are fairly similar in only having a handful of KPIs, whereas the CSRD has 61. Generally speaking, regulations and frameworks will be seen to come through in 2 to 3 years from 2025 onwards. If a US-owned company has European presence, they won't kick in until 2026 or to 2028, however. This month, the ISSB announced the decision to prioritise climate-related disclosures to support initial applications. This will complement its package of transitional reliefs to support companies applying the first 2 standards, which are S1, which are general requirements, and S2, which are climate. This should enable companies to focus initial efforts on ensuring they meet investor information needs around climate change. From the second year of reporting, companies will be required to provide full reporting on sustainability-related risks and opportunities beyond climate, meaning that companies can use the first year to get familiar with concepts and requirements. Finally, the Net Zero Transition Plan is a published action plan for a business's transition to net zero carbon emissions. And in 2024, the UK task force is expected to have published final recommendations, which will be incorporated into the SDR. So the fractured regulatory landscape, with different standards being required at different levels and a proliferating array of sustainability credentials, benchmarks and standards, is making it increasingly difficult for investors and companies to navigate and understand their responsibilities. Looking ahead, alignment of regulatory initiatives, harmonization of targets, and more standardized data will be needed to help improve transparency and enable companies to achieve their decarbonisation targets. The AESRS and the ISSB, as Sunil mentioned earlier, will become the underlying principle for other new regulations and ratings. So yes, roughly speaking, the required disclosures are around 3 years away. However, you will need to start taking action now. The first year, or this year, should be gap analysis time. This is where you will need to figure out where you are regarding the regulations and what is happening. Additionally, roles and responsibilities should be made clear to all of those involved. The second year will require you to ensure that there are no hidden surprises before you start reporting. This will involve building out and improving the accuracy of your data. It is recommended that you prepare a live test at this stage, whereby you start internally reporting. So it doesn't mean that you have to be viewed by anyone other than yourselves, but will make everything much more simple when it comes to reporting. And by the time it comes to publicly reporting, everything should be straightforward and make the process much easier for all those involved. So I will just check the Q&A. So yeah, we can circulate the slides afterwards. That's absolutely fine. And does this have to be implemented in the public sector? I'm aware that there are slightly different regulations for or kind of policy notes for the public sector, but Sunil may correct me here. But I think that some of them for sure will be relevant. But I don't know whether Sunil knows more. But
yeah, so the implementation across the public sector will be slightly different. So certainly we've got things like carbon reduction plans, which are being put out, which are going to be developed out further. So a key question for that is actually understanding the carbon reduction plans and the information which has gone into them and how that aligns with the reporting. So again, we're using the procurement process as a force for good to be able to drive performance rather than somebody saying, I've got a net zero plan to 2030, tick a box, and that meets the criteria. So we've got some of those elements. We've got the Green and Government Commitments, which takes out to 2025 in its current set. That does also look at net zero to be put forward as part of that and separates out some of the Scope 1, Scope 2 activities separately. So again, that's moving the majority of the government statement. We had the reporting on that yesterday of the updates of the public sector stock overall. And then provisions within the regulations as well has separate requirements for energy management and areas such as the responsible business for public sector, which is written within the regulations but targeted separately for public sector. So I think the public sector role within here is one of the slightly separate regulations for the direct element, but given that the public sector is the largest recruiter and the procurer of facilities management services, it's about how to use that role effectively when you're bringing in FM providers to provide support across the estates. So I think that becomes the significant role in here as well.
yeah. Will there be any Brexit impact to the applicability in the UK? I think that some of the EU regulation is going to be carried through into the UK's, but also there are a few like the ISSB, which is an international thing, but I don't know specifically post-Brexit. Again,
Yeah,
I'm hoping Sunil
yeah,
might.
so the Brexit, there's a couple of elements. Some have been transposed directly over, but the recent bill which would cancel all European regulation at the end of the year has been pushed back further. So that's more of a political question as to whether that's going to come through or not. There is a significant amount, but also a lot of the driving changes come through the TCFD, the transition plans, etc., are around what the UK's position wants to be into the future. So those elements are unlikely to change. In fact, they're probably going to be strengthened because of the direction of travel that the UK wants to put itself into, rather than necessarily some of the regulations that happened before. So I see Brexit as having a relatively minimal impact on the direction of travel that we're taking.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
And another question we've got is, what format will qualitative evidence take rather than data? So again, I unfortunately I'm not that sure. But yes, so Sunil, I'm hoping you may know again. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so it's the qualitative. We're looking at it from, I mean, the data itself. One of the challenges that we've had with data is you can cut the cake in so many different ways that we've ended up not really having much trust in the data that has been put forward. And even now we start to see that with some of the commentary and the disclosures which are coming out from organisations. So the qualitative data is very much about the underpinning elements that goes into the headline figure. So what have you done to be able to talk about the scope of what you've been looking at and the boundary setting of your activities? What have you done to understand what's going on to be able to respond to the question? So the examples here would be around modern slavery, an organisation turning around saying we've had no instance of modern slavery within our supply chain. That will then get communicated, and you talk generally around some of the requirements which have happened. But then other parts of where we're going to move towards is disclosure of the number of people who have been trained at site level to be able to spot any occurrences of modern slavery. We're also going to be asking for how you've targeted and how you define what we mean by high risk in terms of modern slavery, and what your engagement has been beyond getting a direct answer from a supply chain questionnaire, and so on and so on. So we're starting to delve into a lot more detail, which is part of the reason why the SRS is looking at 61 key metrics, because we want to build in some of the sub-elements about the behaviours of how an organisation is operating, rather than just the headline performance indicators. So that qualitative evidence, we'll find out that's what's part of what's going to be coming out in June, and then we'll get some more details around how we're going to expect to respond to that over the forthcoming year or two. Yeah. We've also got, if you're a UK PLC with the US parents, well, the 2026 will apply. So for that, we've got a number of the regulations. So across Europe, the ESRS will apply to US parents from 2028. Across the UK, the timelines for the ISSB and the regulatory requirements for that haven't yet been fixed. So the FRC is going to review that later this year, and to be able to report on what the implications will be. They will feed in as part of the financial reporting, so it will come as part of the director's responsibility and fiduciary duties. We're expecting that to be 2026, 2028 sort of timeframe for those activities to be to come live. Yeah.
And I think I will now hand over to Brenda to do the 23 criteria update for this year. and its assessments.